positions yet of leadership and power, but we do have the indispensable task of criticizing and constructive protest. And I find myself reacting just briefly to some of the things that Senator Brooks said. This has to be brief because I do have a little speech to give. Part of the problem with empathy, with professed goals, is that empathy doesn't do us anything. We've had lots of empathy, we've had lots of sympathy, but we feel that for too long our leaders have used politics as the art of making what appears to be impossible, possible. What does it mean to hear that 13.3% of the people in this country are below the poverty line? That is a percentage. We're not interested in social reconstruction. It's human reconstruction. How can we talk about percentages and trends? The complexities are not lost in our analysis, but perhaps they're put into what we consider a more human and eventually a more progressive perspective. The question about possible and impossible was one that we brought with us to Wellesley 4 years ago. We arrived not yet knowing what was not possible. Consequently, we expected a lot. Our attitudes are easily understood, having grown up, having come to consciousness in the first 5 years of this decade, years dominated by men with dreams, men in the civil rights movement, the Peace Corps, the space program. So we arrived at Wellesley and we found, as all of us have found, that there was a gap between expectations and realities. But it wasn't a discouraging gap, and it didn't turn us into cynical, bitter, old women at the age of 18. It just inspired us to do something about that gap. What we did is often difficult for some people to understand. They ask us often, why, if you're dissatisfied, do you stay in a place? Well, if you didn't care a lot about it, you wouldn't stay. It's almost as though my mother used to say, I'll always love you, but there are times when I certainly won't like you. Our love for this place, this particular place, Wellesley College, coupled with our freedom from the burden of an inauthentic reality, allowed us to question basic assumptions underlying our education. Before the days of the media-orchestrated demonstrations, we had our own gathering over in Founders parking lot. We protested against the rigid academic distribution requirement. We worked for a pass-fail system. We worked for say in some of the process of academic decision-making. And luckily, we were in a place where when we questioned the meaning of a liberal arts education, there were people with enough imagination to respond to that questioning. So we have made progress. We have achieved some of the things that initially saw as lacking in that gap between expectations and reality. Many issues, those of sharing power and responsibility, those of assuming power and the responsibility, have been general concerns on campuses throughout the world. But underlying those concerns, there is a theme which is so trite and so old because the words are so familiar. It talks about integrity and trust and respect. Words have a funny way of trapping our minds on the way to our tongues, but there are necessary means, even in this multimedia age, for attempting to come to grasp with some of the inarticulate, maybe even inarticulable, things that we're feeling. We are, all of us, exploring a world that none of us even understands and attempting to create within that uncertainty. But feelings that our prevailing acquisitive and competitive corporate life, including tragically the universities, is not the way of life for us. We're searching for more immediate, ecstatic, and penetrating mode of living. And our questions about institutions, about colleges, about churches, about our governments continue. The questions about those institutions are familiar to all of us. We have seen heralded across the newspapers. Senator Brooks has suggested some of them this morning. But along with using these words, integrity, trust, and respect, in regards to institutions and leaders, we're perhaps harshest with them in regards to ourselves. Every protest, every dissent, whether it's an individual academic paper, Founders parking lot demonstration, is unabashedly an attempt to forge an identity in this particular age. That attempt at forging for many of us over the past 4 years has meant coming to terms with our humanness. Within the context of a society that we perceive, now we can talk about reality. And I would like to talk about reality sometime, authentic reality, inauthentic reality, and what we have to accept of what we see. But our perception of it is that it hovers often between the possibility of disaster and the possibility for imaginatively responding to men's needs. There's a very strange conservative strain that goes through a loft of New Left, collegiate protests that I find very intriguing, because it harkens back to a lot of the old virtues, to the fulfillment of original ideas. And it's also a very unique American experience. It's such a great adventure. It's the experiment in human living. If the experiment in human living doesn't work in this country, in this age, it's not going to work anywhere. But we also know that to be educated, the goal of it must be human liberation, a liberation enabling each of us to fulfill our capacity so as to be free to create within and around ourselves. To be educated to freedom must be evidenced in action. And here again is where we ask ourselves, as we have asked our parents and our teachers, questions about integrity, trust, and respect.